It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the Samsung Odyssey Neo G7, otherwise known as the S32BG75. Might have additional letters at the start and the end, depending on your region and depending on which particular model code for the monitor you're looking at. As usual for a video review, remember that what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software, depends on the processing done by YouTube, and ultimately, and very importantly, it depends on the screen that you're actually viewing the video on. So in no way does it accurately represent what you'd see firsthand. Also be aware that there's a full vision review, which this video review is really a part of, and you can find a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. So the vision review goes into a lot more technical detail. This video is really just designed to aid the explanations given in the vision review. You can also support our work by joining the YouTube channel. That will give you early access to our video reviews and other videos on the channel, and a few other perks as well. Great way of supporting us, but you can also like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. That's a nice way of showing your support as well. This monitor uses a 31.5-inch VA panel from CSOT, and this has a 3840 by 2160, that's 4K UHD resolution. It also has a 1000R curve. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the curve. This is very subjective, and when you look at videos and pictures of the monitor, it has a strange pincushion effect. You'll be able to see that. I can see that on the camera's preview screen, but when I look at the monitor, you don't see that. Certainly not to that extent anyway. But the curve is something which it will take some getting used to, and I'd say that some people aren't going to fully adapt to it. So I've been using the monitor for a few weeks, and I'm still quite consciously aware of the curve. I've used many curved monitors in the past. I tend to prefer ultra-wides with a curve. I think it really kind of fits there. But with 16:9 models like this and such a steep curve, it really does become quite a part of the experience. And when I'm on the desktop, it is something I notice quite readily. And again, this is exaggerated in the video, but I'm just consciously aware of that curve. When I'm gaming, I kind of like it for casual gaming actually. It sort of just draws you in a little bit, adds an extra sense of depth. It's the same when I'm watching movie content, video content. Kind of quite like it there, or I don't mind it there, I should say. But when I'm on the desktop, and if I'm playing games more competitively and I'm spending a lot of time scanning my eyes between the center of the screen and the edges of the screen, I then become, again, very aware of that curve. So yes, I have kind of got a bit more used to it as the review's drawn on. I haven't fully adapted to it. I'm not fully sold on it. It's very subjective. It's certainly part of the experience for this one. Some people are going to like it straight away. Other people are going to warm to it. The other people are just not going to like it. It's just one of those things. So in terms of the resolution and the pixel density, I'll just pull up those windows I just closed. The monitor does offer a nice high pixel density with a 4K UHD resolution spread across a 31.5-inch screen. And that does give you a nice level of clarity. It doesn't have any particular issues in terms of the subpixel rendering. Some VA models have what's called partial subpixel illumination or split subpixels. So they'll only use part of the subpixels when displaying text, and that can give it a soft look, a weird look. This doesn't have that issue. It looks just like other 4K UHD models. I've used IPS models with this resolution as well. It looks just like I'd expect from a 4K UHD model of this size. It does give a very nice crisp look, nice clarity. Everything is very small though. You might want to use scaling, and that's fine. If you want to use scaling in Windows or you want to use application-specific zoom, you can do that. And this is all handled nicely by Windows now, so many applications will scale cleanly. That means that you still benefit from the high pixel density, it's just that your elements become larger. So if you need text to be more readable by using scaling or application-specific zoom, that's not something I'd worry about. You do lose some of the desktop real estate as everything becomes larger, but if you use a relatively low level of scaling or no scaling, as I'm happy to use, then you do get a huge amount of desktop real estate. It's really nice for multitasking. And also suitably high resolution image content has a good crisp look, and so does suitably high resolution movie content, although that tends to be sort of more heavily compressed, so that doesn't necessarily reflect the resolution and pixel density quite as well as games. And this is something I explore more in an article on the website all about the 4K UHD experience. I also explored a little bit in the 4K UHD experience section of the written review, so well worth checking that out. Something I just want to briefly mention are what I'd call static interlace patterns, interlace pattern artifacts. Some people call them scan lines or inversion artifacts. The Neo G8 is known to have them in a rather obvious way at 240 Hz. It's something which this model doesn't suffer from in the same way. It does have this issue. So if you're not familiar, it means that some shades appear as fine interlaced lines. They're horizontal in this case, and they alternate between a slightly lighter and darker version of the intended shade. They don't appear throughout the screen, and in this case they're rather faint. Even at 165 Hz, I can actually still see them at 120 Hz, and at 60 Hz there's a kind of slight checkerboard pattern I can see at times. Honestly, I'm not trying to scare you with this, because with the G7, with this model, it's really not a big issue. I don't think most people would actually notice them at all in this case. Some people will. Some people are sensitive enough to notice them, but they're not extreme in this case. It's explored more in the written review in the interlace pattern artifact section there. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. So of course there's that curve which I've mentioned. The other thing that curve does is it does tend to stretch the glare out on the screen. When you're viewing it from a normal viewing position, it depends on your viewing environment, your lighting conditions. I didn't really have any particular issues with glare. If there was strong direct light striking the screen surface, then yes, you can get some glare, and it has a little bit of what I call a glassy look. I classify this as a light to very light matte anti-glare screen surface, but if you move off angle, the glassy look becomes more apparent, and there's also this strange stretching of the glare. So I actually found that if I'm viewing it a bit off angle, it tends to sort of haze the screen up, and that can flood the image quite noticeably. I didn't tend to have that from a normal viewing position. And with it being what I classify as a light to very light matte anti-glare screen surface, there are some advantages, and I talk a little bit about that in the contrast section of the video. And just in general, it does offer decent glare handling. Isn't as strong as some matte screen surfaces, but it's stronger than others, so it's pretty decent in that respect, really. Just focusing on the screen area itself still, it has dual stage bezels, so that means there is a slim panel border that's flush with the rest of the screen. Difficult to see when the screen's switched off as it is now, but as you'll see elsewhere in the review, when it's switched on, you do see that panel border. That's just a feature of the panel. It's very common for modern monitors. And then there is a slim hard plastic outer part as well. The general styling though, just typical Samsung Odyssey affair really, but no super colourful elements or anything like that. The exception would be, I suppose, if you have these little cheeks there active. They're part of the Infinity Core lighting feature. There's also a light at the back, which gives a little bit of a glow around the monitor, but it's really more visible from the rear. It isn't really bright enough to be a bias light or anything like that. Anyway, this lighting system, it's all explored in the OSD video, so check that out. It's all timestamped, so you don't have to look at the entire video. The stand as well. I'm not a huge fan of this stand, to be honest. A few reasons for that. One is that it's quite deep. Exact measurements are given in the written review. I also give measurements for the adjustability in the written review, but it is quite good in terms of ergonomics. At least you can adjust the height, you can swivel it, you can tilt it, and you can pivot it into portrait. But focusing on this penguin foot stand design, this is a premium monitor, premium priced monitor. I like to have brushed metal on my stand, or coated metal, when really the stand is such a big feature. There's quite a lot of stand on this monitor, but this one is just plastic coated. And also the screen has incredible wobble, about as wobbly as I've seen on a monitor. I know not everyone will tap their monitor like this, but just for a premium monitor, it kind of just cheapens the overall feel, in my opinion. And when you're using the OSD system, so the joystick, again, it's explored in the OSD video, that's at the bottom of the monitor, it tends to wobble as well. My desk's quite solid, so I don't have any issues with it wobbling when I'm just typing or using my mouse or anything like that, but depending on your desk, that could potentially be an issue as well. At the rear, you can see these radial patterns. It's all matte black plastic, a little bit of glossy plastic as well mixed in. And there's this core lighting feature, the Infinity Core lighting feature at the back, which I was talking about just before. You can see that the stand, fairly solid in terms of the construction of the stand neck. Again, I prefer metal, but it is actually plated, so it's got good weight to it, or at least the base is metal plated. So it does have a decent weight to it, but it's really just the way that the screen is attached to the stand. It does make it rather wobbly. There's also a little cable tidy at the bottom here, just made of rubber. You can clip it off if you want, but it's pretty harmless just sitting there even if you're not using it. There's also a case slot towards the bottom right there, some ventilation slats at the top, and when you actually get the monitor, the stand isn't attached, so you have to attach it yourself and screw it in, and then you put this little plastic cover over it. So if you don't have that plastic cover on, or you remove it, so you just sort of twist it off, it's actually in two halves, so you can remove it quite easily, unscrew the stand. You're then left with 100 by 100mm VESA holes for alternative mounting. An adapter bracket is included with the product as well, or certainly should be, if your retailer's not fobbing you off. So the ports, they face downwards, and again you can see a bit of glossy black plastic there. Not a huge fan of glossy black plastics, but it's fairly minimal on this one, so that's okay. Two HDMI 2.1 ports, DisplayPort 1.4a with DSC. There is one lonely little USB 3 port. It also has service written on it, so it can be used to upgrade the firmware of the monitor. There is a little feature in the OSD to do that, so if Samsung posts little updates for firmware, it'll be on the product page or the service page for the product. At the other side, you've got a USB-B port upstream for the USB. You've got another USB port, so yes, you do get two USB ports. Very generous, Samsung. And there's a 3.5mm headphone jack with a nice banana-y yellow colour. And then there is a DC power input, so the monitor does have an external power brick. And excuse the dust, but it is a rather large power brick. And again, lots of glossy black plastic, not a huge fan of that. So I do like to quickly mention a little bit about the capabilities of those ports, or the display connections at least. You can find more about them in the written review in the features and aesthetics section, and a little bit in the specifications section as well. But that is HDMI 2.1. It has a 40 gigabits per second bandwidth, so it allows you to use the full capabilities of the PS5, the Xbox Series X, and also the PC. So it runs at 165 Hz on a PC, or 120 on those consoles, maximum at 3840 by 2160, that's 4K UHD. You can do the same via DisplayPort as well. And with both connections, you get support for HDR, you get VRR support as well. It includes HDMI 2.1 VRR and adaptive sync. That allows you to use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode, as well as AMD FreeSync, or FreeSync Premium Pro more specifically in this case. Again, if you're interested more about the exact resolution support, bit depth, that kind of thing, then check out the written review. I'd like to start off this section by talking a bit about Black Crush. This is something which is difficult to show with in-game examples, so I like to start with a little very scientific PCM Black Crush test, which is something I totally just made up, but kind of shows it quite nicely. So what you can see here is a dark background with slightly lighter grey, still dark grey, text which says PCM. It's actually the same grey throughout the screen, except you might notice that towards the centre of the screen, or the area which is in line with your eyes, or the camera in this case, it appears more blended, and that's because the perceived gamma is lower there for these very dark shades. They blend into a kind of dark or black mass, so it looks darker than it should. Whereas if you look at that towards the top of the screen, it would also be the sides. Difficult to show that on the camera because it's a bit more subtle, but you will see that the visibility does improve there versus more centrally still. And from a normal viewing position, you might have your head a little bit above centre. It definitely tends to be that towards the bottom of the screen you notice this more clearly. And actually the perceived gamma can be a bit low for these shades towards the bottom of the screen and the extreme side edges. That means it can reveal a bit of unintended detail in dark shades. Now, the Black Crush on this model and the sort of perceived gamma shifts in general, they're not too bad. It's quite, I suppose, standard for a modern VA panel, I'd say. I've seen this kind of performance from many VA panels. It's not bad. Certainly some VA models are much worse in this respect, but it's not the best I've seen either, and I'm going to compare to the AOC CQ32G3SU at various points in this review, and that's because it uses a modern VA panel from a competitor to CSOT, AU Optronics. It actually does have a bit of an edge when it comes to Black Crush and gamma consistency in general. This also can affect saturation levels, and I'll come on to that when I talk about colour reproduction. This is something which IPS models are much better at, and OLEDs are really fantastic in this respect. So it is something I like to point out. It's something which most reviewers don't even bother talking about because it's not something which their calibration instruments will pick up, but it's certainly something your eyes will pick up, so I do like to talk about it. It's less apparent if you sit further from the monitor. I tend to sit around 70 centimeters from the monitor, or 70 to 80 centimeters, depends on my posture. If you sit a bit closer, then the Black Crush, the gamma shifts and all of this can be more obvious. Further back, less obvious. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about the contrast performance using some in-game examples. So I'm not going to go through Black Crush again. I think I've said enough about that. Gave some very specific examples, but yes, it is something you can see in game and various other places as well when you're on the desktop, movies, whatever it might be. But it's not extreme on this model, so don't spend too much of your time worrying about that. I just like to point out that it is there. Yes, it does exist on this model. Even if it is a high-priced VA model, you still do get some of that. The other thing is VA glow. So I just like to start with the weaknesses, just get them out the way. Yes, there is some VA glow. You can see that in this scene here, for example, towards the bottom of the screen, a bit towards the top. People aren't always aware that this is a thing. It isn't the same as IPS glow. It's not as strong, it's not as extreme, it doesn't have the same effect on detail and atmosphere really. And I would say it is exaggerated a bit more on the camera, particularly higher up, and it depends on your viewing position as to how strong it will be in various points of the screen. Also be aware that I'm sitting in a very dark room here. In a brighter room, you're not going to notice this. It's just something I like to point out because it is there. But overall, this monitor does offer strong contrast. So I measured around 3500 to 1 under my test settings. So that's very strong. It's much stronger than you'd get on any IPS type panel without fancy local dimming. I'll come on to local dimming shortly, explore that separately. And it does give a nicer depth and a nicer atmosphere to these darker shades. It also actually helps give some of these medium shades a bit of extra depth as well, particularly for the sort of central bulk of the screen where it's not affected by any of the gamma shift or anything like that. So there are lots of dark areas on this game, lots of dark passageways, tombs, that kind of thing. So on games like this, the strong contrast is certainly a nice thing to have. For brighter shades, the fire here, a lovely example just sitting here for me to talk about. The screen surface does have a bit of graininess to it. This is something that I'm very sensitive to. I think the level of graininess on this one, most people aren't going to actually really notice it or aren't going to find it bothersome. And as I mentioned earlier, it's what I'd classify as a light to very light matte anti-glare screen surface. That means it doesn't have the same amount of layering as stronger matte screen surfaces in front of the image. It does have a bit more of that, I'd say, than what I would describe as light to very light matte IPS models or IPS models with that kind of screen surface. I've tested quite a few of those recently. And I think that might be partly due to the curve. The curve of the screen kind of gives a bit more of a layering effect. If you don't know what layering is, it's probably not something you're actually sensitive to and don't really have to worry about. But if you know, you know. It's one of those things where stronger matte screen surfaces can really look like there's a sort of almost a window in front of the image, that kind of thing. So this isn't really bad in that respect. And with it being a light to very light matte anti-glare screen surface, it also allows more direct emission of light from the monitor. It also means that glare tends to be diffused less across the screen. It does depend how bright your room is because you will still get some diffused glare. It really does depend on your lighting conditions. But there are some lighting conditions where stronger matte screen surfaces will really just flood the image with this obvious haze, whereas with a light to very light matte surface that doesn't happen as often. And I did mention earlier that if you go off angle because of the curve of this one, that tends to happen more. That can be an issue. But compared to the Odyssey Neo G8, I'd just like to draw a quick comparison there. That one has a stronger matte screen surface. I'd probably classify that one as just light matte or possibly medium to light or relatively light. I'm not really entirely sure, but it is certainly not as light as this one. So that can suffer more from this layering, can have a bit more graininess actually. It diffuses the light emitted from the monitor more, diffuses ambient light from the room more as well. So it does offer technically stronger glare handling, but that can also haze up the image a bit more. Personal preferences, I prefer the screen surface on this one, the Neo G7. And I'm going to talk about local dimming. So I'm just going to turn that on. I'm going to turn it on to high. It has three different settings, auto, high and low. So I've got this active. It adds a lot more depth overall to the dark shades. It subdues the VA glow. You might be able to see what you think is VA glow, but be aware that that's actually just because that's a slightly lighter shade. It's not pure black being shown here, by the way. It's just various different dark shades. So it really does help in terms of the atmosphere. And I actually really do like using this setting overall when I'm gaming. There is a low setting. I'm just going to quickly switch over to that just to demonstrate it. So I've switched over to low. There's not really much that you can take away from the video. You won't be able to see this in enough detail really, but the black depth and the depth of those dark shades is actually raised a bit, and also the brighter shades aren't as bright. It's basically less dynamic. It doesn't dim as much and it doesn't raise as much. I'd explore the dimming solution in more detail in the written review, but it's what Samsung calls a quantum matrix solution. It's mini LED with 1196 dimming zones. So obviously that doesn't give you OLED level precision where you'd have effectively millions of dimming zones per pixel illumination. but it is actually very good for an LCD. Most local dimming solutions on LCDs are a lot worse than this one. But the low setting, it's not very dynamic. I would stick to high. There is an auto setting, and what that's supposed to do is it's supposed to actually disable itself for SDR and enable itself for HDR. This is SDR content, by the way. But I've found that sometimes it enables itself for certain SDR content. It doesn't actually look at whether the signal is HDR or not. And when I'm on Twitter dark mode, this is a typical example of when it will turn itself on. And when it does turn itself on, it's quite similar to the high setting, really. I'll talk a little bit more about this when I get onto HDR, but I've just switched back to the high setting so I can continue witchering on about that. You can adjust the brightness with this setting. I just use my test settings, but you might want to go brighter. It will make the bright shades brighter than when you have this setting disabled under SDR. And if you want a really dynamic experience, you could push this all the way up to 100. It's still going to dim effectively for dark shades, but you'll get some really nice bursts of brightness, actually very impressive for SDR. I measured well above 1000 nits under SDR, which might surprise some of you, using the dynamic dimming setting. Coming again onto the dimming algorithm and the zone count, it does mean that there is some haloing. You might be able to see it a bit around my crosshair there, some of my HUD elements as well. They're brighter than the background, and there's a crossover with the dimming zones, so some of the dimming zones are trying to show bright and dark content at the same time. This monitor does tend to dark bias, which does reduce these halos, plus it has a natively strong contrast VA panel, which also means these halos aren't sort of as obvious as they can be on some solutions. And I'd actually say that overall they're as subtle as I've seen on any LCD. Of course you don't get it on OLED, but it is something which, and you might notice it quite noticeably there, that tree of life thing that just came up, that was actually, it was showing that really quite brightly, so that's why there was a halo around there. If you're in a brighter room, you don't notice this so much. I know I usually brighten up the room and talk about how it reduces VA glow and all of that, and I kind of forgot to do that earlier before I turned on local dimming. So I'll just very quickly do that just to show you what I'm talking about here. Now all you see really is glare on the screen, but that's because this scene is rather dim and because of the way I've got the camera set up and the lighting and all of that. But the point is that you're not going to readily notice the VA glow, anything like that. The depth of these dark shades is, well, I mean, they're so dark, that's why there's quite a lot of glare. So it is very impressive whether you're in a darker room or a brighter room. It's going to give you a nice experience in terms of contrast. But coming back to that dark biasing, I'm just going to darken the room up a bit again. So it isn't just that the bright elements will be dragged down so they're less bright than they could be if they're surrounded by darker shades and there's a cross coverage with the dimming zones. It also means that medium shades are dragged down as well, and dark to medium shades are dragged down. And I find when I'm playing competitively, let's say, this could be a disadvantage because it makes enemies less visible in dark areas. You can kind of offset this if you change the black equalizer setting, you lower that, or you change the gamma mode, but then it really makes things look quite washed out and flooded, and it really detracts from the purpose of this local dimming solution. So I would generally recommend, sort of for competitive play, maybe just don't use local dimming. But some people might still like to, personal preference. By all means, have a go with it. And you won't be able to appreciate this in the video necessarily. There's definitely a great improvement to the mixed dark to very dark shades here. The skulls are nice and visible, more so than when I had the setting disabled. The gamma shifts still come into play, so there's even extra detail towards the bottom of the screen and the extreme side edges. Again, not extreme shifts here. The dimming zones are also very reactive. I don't have any issues with the sort of speed of reactivity. There aren't these sort of trails of blooming everywhere like you get with some lesser mini LED solutions. So I think they've tuned it pretty well, in my opinion. But yes, the dark biasing, some people might find it a bit strange because it does make some shades a bit darker than you might expect and some scenes darker than you might expect, and it can limit brightness in some circumstances and all of that. But I think overall the benefits outweigh the cons when you're playing games non-competitively and you're watching movie and video content. And you know me, I never like to end on a high note in a section. Well, I actually do often, but in this case I would just like to point out that on the desktop I don't like to use this setting. I've got it set to high still, and I'm on Twitter dark mode. I'm not sure how this will come across on the camera because it's sort of an extreme contrast situation which the camera doesn't much like showing in an accurate way, I'm afraid. But I can definitely see the haloing around these brighter shades. But actually what I tend to notice more readily is that the brighter shades are, because of the dark biasing, dragged down, so they're dimmer than I'd like. The mouse cursor is a really good example of that. And if you compare the brightness of that white to the mouse cursor, it should actually be identical, but it isn't because, of course, there's more bright shade there, whereas this is just a small bright shade, so the dark biasing again crushes that down. And this can be just a bit disconcerting, and I just don't like these inconsistencies. And they do definitely crop up in places. It isn't just these extreme high contrast situations where these inconsistencies can be a bit weird on the desktop. It seems to be showing this actually better on the video. There are a lot of inconsistencies here. So this is Hard Forum, Hardware Enthusiast Forum. And these little stripes, these rows here, they're supposed to be the same shade. There's basically just two shades of grey alternating between a lighter and darker grey throughout the screen. You can see sort of a haloing around the brighter icons down there, but also the text to the left, it lightens up the grey shade because of the sort of the haloing or blooming effect. It's darker towards the middle, except for if my mouse cursor is moving around. There are some weird striations in the middle you might be able to see on the video. That's not something you notice to the eye, or maybe it's very faint to the eye. It's exaggerated in the video, so don't worry too much about that. And again, brighter content there lifts up those grey shades as well. So these kind of inconsistencies, I just find them annoying. Just turned local dimming off, just to show you that things are more consistent in terms of there being no haloing or blooming. You can't see it around my mouse either. Again, be aware that there are some striations and sort of patchiness, which is exaggerated in the video. But because of the gamma shifts, it does naturally become brighter towards the bottom of the screen anyway. You will be able to see the shifts in the grey. That's just what I was talking about before in terms of the perceived gamma shifts. That's not affected by local dimming. That occurs with local dimming and without. And you might think, well, I could just use the low setting on the desktop. You can. I mean, that does decrease the blooming because things are far less dynamic and all of that. There is still some of this inconsistency going on. There is a bit of brightening to the grey there and there versus the centre. I'm just going to go back to Twitter dark mode again, or lights out as they call it. And it definitely drags things down quite a lot actually. It really does heavily dark bias with the low setting. This white is really unimpressively dim, whereas the taskbar and the bright elements there, they're much brighter. So again, there's just inconsistencies I don't like. Some people might find it fine, and okay if you do. If you're using the auto setting and it happens to work properly for you, it doesn't for me. It, as I said, it sort of activates with some content on the desktop, also some scenes in games and some scenes in movies. Talk a little bit more about this in the written review. If it works for you and you want to stick to that, then it's going to give you a similar experience to if local dimming is set to high when it does actually kick in, and that will include for HDR content. I'm going to move on now to the colour reproduction section of the review, and I'd like to start off with Lagom, lagom.nl, and the tests for viewing angles on that website. So the Lagom text, that would ideally appear consistent throughout the screen. It would appear a blended grey with blended look to the striping of the text throughout the screen. In this case, there's sort of a cone which is much more blended in the centre of the screen, or the region which is in line with your eyes, or in this case the camera. And there's a bit of a green tint. You probably can't see that in the video, but to the eye there is a green tint to the striping of the text there. That then peters out a bit, and there's a sort of dirty look to it, for lack of a better phrase. It kind of has some black to the striping of the text towards the edges of the screen, and there's a bit of red introduced as well, especially lower down. You can see that in the video as well. And these are just due to inconsistencies in the gamma behavior of the monitor. But what there isn't a sort of distinct shift between saturated red, orange, and saturated green, perhaps in the other order to what I said just then, but you get the idea. There aren't these shifts vertically as you'd get with a TN panel. So it's quite typical for VA panels to have these kind of this sort of cone of more blended area and other colours around it. So I'm not too concerned about that, or too surprised by that, I should say. The pink block always appears weird in the video, I'm afraid. It's a pinkish purple throughout the screen, but it has a stronger pink tint towards the bottom and also the extreme side edges. The red block appears a bit more consistent actually, but it does lose some saturation towards the bottom and the edges of the screen. I should mention that if you're viewing the monitor a bit lower down, depends on your viewing position, it is a large monitor, so you may be viewing it from a different viewing position to what I've got set up here, then you might notice some losses of saturation towards the top. The green block, that's pretty consistent, a slightly yellowish green chartreuse shade throughout the screen, a bit more yellow towards the extreme edges of the screen, and also a bit more towards the bottom. The blue, fairly consistent royal blue throughout the screen, a little bit darker, or a little bit duller, you might say, towards the edges of the screen. And these shifts I'm showing you here, they're not extreme for a VA panel. I've certainly seen more extreme shifts. Again, need to draw a comparison with the AOC CQ32G3SU, and the shifts here are less extreme. What I'd recommend actually is looking at the Spyderchecker 24 section of the written review, because that gives some really nice visual demonstrations of these shifts and the colour consistency in general, and also the impact of the gamut, which I'm going to talk about with some in-game examples shortly. This is really good, and you can also compare that to what I said and what I show you with the CQ32G3SU, and really the AU Optronics panel is just a bit better when it comes to gamma consistency and colour consistency. But that's not to say this panel is bad for a VA panel, it's just that the AOC is particularly good. I'm now on Battlefield 2042, and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. So first of all, yes, there are those inconsistencies. Oh, come on. Yeah, I should really choose a game that's not multiplayer when I try and talk about colour reproduction. So, where was I? Yes, inconsistencies in terms of the colour reproduction which you wouldn't get on IPS or OLED models. Not extreme for a VA model, but not the best I've seen either. There's a nice rich golden brown look to the grass here, which is reduced when you look at that close to the bottom of the screen, for example, and also the side edges. Might not be really so apparent on the video, but to the eye it is something that you can notice, certainly something I'd notice. Not extreme shifts again. But overall the monitor does have a fairly vibrant look, and that's partly due to the colour gamut, and that extends comfortably beyond sRGB. I measured 91% of the DCI-P3 colour space. I'll show you that on the screen. So you can see that it doesn't fully cover DCI-P3, there's a bit of missing coverage in some regions. It actually extends a bit beyond for some other shades, so mainly in the red region, but the red to blue edge. So what this all means is, content like this, it's designed with the sRGB colour space in mind. When you view it on a wider colour gamut, or model with a wider colour gamut, and it's not just games, this would apply to a lot of content on the desktop as well, if you're watching videos and that kind of thing. It's generally designed with the sRGB colour space in mind. Wider colour gamut than that, that means that there's extra saturation and extra vibrancy beyond what the creators intend. So that's what you get here. It isn't an extreme boost of vibrancy and saturation in this case because the colour gamut isn't super wide. And actually this monitor has a quantum dot backlight solution. I have to say that the gamut is actually quite weak for a quantum dot backlight solution when you look at them as a whole. Anyway, I don't want to get too into the weeds here. But just to point out that quantum dots don't automatically mean supremely vibrant oversaturated colours. It's not really what you get here, you just get a bit of a boost in saturation. So the sky blues there, they look punchy, they look more saturated than they should. There are some quite punchy looking green shades as well, but they don't really verge on neon. I wouldn't describe them as neon, they don't go that strong with the saturation. Some of the yellowish greens are brought out quite strongly as well. Some of the earthy browns have a bit of a reddish quality to them, but this particular brown is a fairly faded clay-like brown anyway. Does also show off those saturation shifts quite nicely, but that's not really what I was trying to talk about here. With skin tones in places as well, they just look a bit more rich. I wouldn't say they look sunburnt or overly sun-kissed on this model. Maybe a little bit of that depending on the skin tone. And again, because of the losses of saturation, if anything, they actually look more appropriate towards the bottom and the side edges of the screen. So they lose a bit of that extra richness, extra saturation. But overall, the monitor does provide vibrant colour output. And the red of that crate there, the light blue as well, a good amount of vibrancy, a good amount of pop to those colours. If you prefer things to look more as the developers intend, more subdued, there is an sRGB emulation setting on this monitor. You change the picture mode to sRGB. And that makes things look more muted. you don't have that extra saturation, but actually things pull too far the other way. That isn't because of the gamut, so I'm going to show you the gamut on the screen briefly. So you can see that there's 98% sRGB coverage now, but the gamut is reduced significantly compared to the native gamut. It was covering 91% DCI-P3, that's what I'd measured. So it does mute these shades, so there's certainly less of a pop to the red there, the blue there. But I would again refer to the Spider Checker 24 section of the written review, because there's a really nice comparison with sort of the relative look of shades there versus using this sRGB emulation setting, which clamps the gamut close to sRGB. So it does make a dramatic difference. Some people will prefer this look. As explored in the Spider Checker 24 section, it goes a little bit too far really. Some shades appear undersaturated, particularly in the regions of the screen where saturation is naturally reduced because of those perceived gamma shifts. So in terms of using this monitor for colour critical work, because I know not everyone's going to be just gaming on the monitor or just using it for general purpose use or content consumption, really I wouldn't recommend VA models in general for this because of those inconsistencies, the gamma shifts and the saturation shifts, which I've discussed at some length now. So even if you do happen to calibrate it perfectly for sRGB or as much of the DCI-P3 space as you can manage, for example, then you are going to still have those shifts, so it's not ideal. It's sort of passable. There's hobbyist level photo editing and that kind of thing if it's well calibrated. But also be aware of the native gamut, 91% DCI-P3. There's a lot of DCI-P3 coverage missing and a lot of Adobe RGB coverage missing. I talk more about Adobe RGB in the written review, but if you want to work within that colour space, this one doesn't even cover 90% of that. I'm back on Shadow of the Tomb Raider and I'm running the game under HDR now, so the monitor's also running in HDR. You'll notice that there is a lot of control that you still get under HDR on this monitor. You adjust the brightness, you can also adjust the colour channels, that kind of thing, the gamma. I wouldn't recommend you fiddle with any of this or don't make extensive adjustments with any of this because it's really going to pull things away from the intended look for HDR10 content, which is the format that this monitor supports. If you're really finding it uncomfortably bright, then yes, you can reduce brightness a bit. If you reduce the brightness a lot, then things really start to look quite faded and washed out. It doesn't just neatly map everything to a lower peak brightness or anything like that. So it's really designed to be run at full brightness. If you need to decrease that a little bit, by all means do. And with the color channels, if you notice obvious tints, then you can get rid of them by making color channel adjustments. So that's a nice flexibility to have, but don't go too extreme with those adjustments either. So I've got the local dimming set to high. It works in much the same way as I explained with SDR. Low is again really the undynamic setting. You can have a play with that if you want, but it really doesn't make good use of the local dimming solution in my opinion. High on the other hand does. Auto does as well. Auto and high quite similar to one another. The high setting does give a bit of extra brightness to some of the HDR highlights, but there's not a huge amount in it, to be honest, not a huge difference. And rather than me just talk extensively at the start of this section, I think it'd be better if I just show you some numbers, because I know some people absorb information better with a bit of numerical context. So with this graph, you can see the monitor running with the high, auto and low settings. The peak luminance is achieved with the high and the auto setting at a 4% window, 4% patch. So that means 4% of the screen is showing white, the rest of the screen is showing black in this particular test. So it's a white patch surrounded by black. You can also see in general that the low setting is just lower in terms of its luminance levels throughout the range. The reason that you don't get that peak luminance straight away with the 1% patch or 1% window, remember that it's a white patch surrounded by black, and with the dark biasing of the local dimming, it does drag the white luminance down. But it does maintain good brightness levels for 4% patch, 9% patch. It starts to dim again at 25% a bit, but it's still reasonably bright. And by 49% and 100%, it dims more significantly. So what does this mean in practice? Well, it means that the monitor is able to pump out nice luminance levels, where there's even a reasonably high amount of brightness on the screen, but still a mixed scene really. So for this scene here, the local dimming, first of all, it does work very effectively to deepen those dark shades. There's a nice atmospheric look there. It doesn't give you OLED level precision, so ideally you would have even more depth for the sort of cracks in the rocks and the joins in the rocks, that kind of thing. But it has to compromise because it's not just showing pure black here, so there's a little bit of lifting up of shades, but it does does pretty well though. It does pretty well in this respect. And also the dark to medium shades are nice and deep as well. If you look carefully, you might be able to see a little bit of haloing or blooming around the cursor there and the HUD elements. I have to say that the camera exaggerates it quite a lot around the HUD elements there. To the eye, it's far more subtle than it appears on the camera, but it does indeed show that it exists. The blooming, the haloing, it's also somewhat more noticeable towards the bottom of the screen and the side edges. It's sort of viewing angle dependent. If you look at the viewing angles video and you look at the dark desktop where I turn local dimming on, you'll see a quite extreme example of that. So anyway, the bright shades here, nice and bright, the darker shades nice and dim, so it really does give a dynamic experience for this kind of scene. It does work well overall, and to be honest, it's well above average for an LCD in terms of its performance here. And actually, if you think about the peak brightness levels, sort of just a bit above 1300 nits, and it's actually still above 1000 nits according to my measurements, even at a 25% white window. OLEDs will have dimmed a lot more by then, so OLED models like the ASUS PG42UQ and the Dell Alienware AW3423DW, they would dim more aggressively. So even with this scene here, for example, the brightness here, they would dim quite noticeably. At this point, there is a bit of dimming if I zoom in here because the bright shades do start to dominate a bit, so it isn't as bright as it could be all the time. There is a noticeable difference between that and that. And remember that the camera is making its own adjustments, so you're not getting an accurate depiction of this with the camera. But there are certainly shifts there. Still pretty bright though. I'm just going to dive into this. I will show you some scenes from some other games because I do like a bit of variety here. So this scene here is one I quite like for testing HDR. It just sort of easily separates decent HDR performers from not so decent HDR performers. And the ability for it to pump out a good amount of brightness is very evident with the glare on the water surface there. Again, can't appreciate this in the video. And also there's more detail there. There's not a huge ball of light as it looks like in the video. There's more detail. The light streaming up above there as well, more detail. I'm just going to take a little sidebar here and mention a few things because I didn't mention them earlier on. First of all, I'm using an RTX 3090 at the moment, and I tested this monitor via HDMI as well as DisplayPort, very similar experience. And I've also tested it with an AMD GPU, and again HDMI and DisplayPort there, and compared to the NVIDIA counterpart, very similar. So the monitor is very consistent with its HDR performance across different GPUs. And remember that as a games console user, you're going to be connected via HDMI, and you'll have AMD hardware. That's why I like to test not just NVIDIA with DisplayPort, but do more extensive testing. So yes, nice and consistent there. Another thing I like to mention, 10-bit color reproduction. Haven't mentioned so far, the monitor does support that natively, and that is put to good use with HDR10 content such as this. So you get an enhanced nuanced shade variety for these nice dark shades there, for example. It allows the colour gamut to be put to good use, the fairly wide colour gamut, and it also gives you gentler gradients, gentler, more natural looking progressions of shades for weather effects and that kind of thing. So you can see that here. Unfortunately you can't see that in the video, but I can see it to my eye, so that all works very nicely. And again, per pixel illumination would help give even more depth to some of these dark shades, but it does maintain a nice solidity to the medium shades there, good depth to the dark shades, and the bright shades shown at the same time. Nice and bright in this particular scene. I'm now on Battlefield 5, and I'm on this really very bright dominated scene. It's not entirely bright, it's not just sort of pure white or anything like that. You can see it is mixed, but it does bias more towards these bright shades. This is a scene I showed you with the ASUS PG32UQX, and that is an extremely capable monitor when it comes to HDR brightness. That really does set a benchmark in my mind in terms of HDR brightness performance. And this scene was incredibly bright there. That actually peaks up to around 2000 nits, and it can sustain 1200 nits. That means even if the screen was showing pure white for a prolonged period of time, it would be able to sustain incredible luminance there. As you can see from the measurements, this model just doesn't provide that kind of experience. And in this scene here, it is still bright, and if I compare it to the Dell Alienware, the QD OLED, which I also tested with this scene briefly, and I sort of drew the comparison with the ASUS there as well. The Samsung here really stands somewhere between those two, the Alienware and the ASUS. Remember, the ASUS is a mini LED IPS model, it isn't OLED. So it does sustain decent brightness levels, But when I look at the sun there, for example, with the sky in the background, it isn't super bright, not by HDR standards. And the glow around the clouds as well isn't quite as bright as it could be, quite as bright and brilliant. The reflections of the light on the icy surface down there as well, again, not as brilliant as it could be. So if I compare to the glare on the, or glint of light on the water surface in that Shadow of the Tomb Raider scene I just showed you, there isn't that kind of impact with these bright shades anymore. But it doesn't look dull either. I'm now on a different scene on Battlefield 5. This is one which I've used recently when I reviewed the BenQ EX3210U. This is another scene which I quite like to use actually to talk about HDR performance. It's quite varied and it does kind of highlight various different strengths and weaknesses with this model. So the BenQ, it doesn't offer the peak luminance that this one does. It doesn't have anywhere near the same local dimming capability. So this scene just looked quite washed out, quite flooded in many respects. Whereas on the Samsung, it's more impressive, although not up to OLED levels of impressiveness. And I'll come on to that a little bit shortly. But certainly when you look at the light there, very bright indeed. And again, the 10-bit color reproduction helps with the nuanced shade variety. That's all nice as well. There's some good bright areas in the background as well, although because of the dark biasing of the local dimming, they are pulled down a little bit. And something I'm just going to come on to, glowing embers here. This is something which is more impressive on OLED models actually. And that's because this area directly surrounding the embers, there is a bit of haloing. I mean, there's a natural glow from the game just because of the graphics and how they've done this, so the haloing is not really a big issue. But again, there's that dark biasing, so the embers aren't really as bright and brilliant as they could be, and I've actually seen them looking brighter on the Dell Alienware, for example. They become actually a bit more impressive when they're a bit larger, so I'm a bit closer to them here, but they're not as eye-catching as you might expect given the peak luminance capabilities of this monitor. But that's a compromise that's made. Alternatively, if the monitor decided not to dark bias with the local dimming, there'd be more halos, they'd be more obvious. Dark shades would be lifted up too much a lot of the time. So it's a compromise either way. And that's, again, an area where OLED models are really very strong with their per pixel illumination. But I would say overall, the local dimming solution with its 1196 zones, it does a lot better than most LCDs under HDR. I know that's not really saying much, but I've tested quite a few of varying HDR levels, and for mixed content like this, yes, there is a bit of dragging down of some of the bright shades, but overall it is a nice dynamic and engaging HDR experience it gives here. I'm back on Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I was going to show you some Cyberpunk, but to be completely honest, the scenes I was going to show you, I've really covered this with scenes with Shadow of the Tomb Raider and Battlefield 5, and this video is already more than long enough, so I really don't want to go there. So I'm going to focus more on the colour reproduction side of things here. The monitor's gamut, as I showed you, 91% DCI-P3. It depends on your measurement software and measurement instruments. Some reviewers may get a little bit more than that, but either way, it does not cover the same amount of Rec 2020 as models like the Dell Alienware AW3423DW, and nowhere near as much as the Asus PG32UQX. So it doesn't have the same level of vibrancy, even the potential level of vibrancy. Then you have to factor in those saturation losses lower down the screen towards the edges, which I've mentioned, and that takes a little bit away from it as well. So it doesn't look as vibrant as those, but it doesn't look washed out either. And again, the local dimming solution really helps here, keeps these medium shades nice and solid looking overall. And with the colour gamut still being reasonably wide, yes, it doesn't really fully satisfy the DCI-P3 requirements and comes nowhere near Rec 2020. So remember that under HDR, for HDR10 content, the developers have these wider colour gamuts in mind. They're not targeting sRGB anymore. They don't have sRGB in mind most of the time. They really do have these wider colour spaces in mind, so it's nice to have really good coverage of those. This monitor instead offers reasonable DCI-P3 coverage, but nothing beyond that. So what does that mean? Well, the green shades here, fairly vibrant, not as vibrant as I've seen them, but they don't look washed out. They do have good pop, and also because they're actually targeting these wider colour spaces, you don't get the kind of overdone yellowish greens or some overly bright greens that you get under SDR, so there's actually more depth, and some of the more muted shades do look more muted, more appropriate in that respect. Lara's skin as well, it looks a bit overdone under SDR, but under HDR it's toned down, looks more appropriate. although there is a bit of loss of saturation towards the bottom there, so her legs there look a little bit paler than they should. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that it looks washed out at all. It's just that if you do draw comparisons with some of these other models, certainly I've tested a lot of models which are very vibrant under HDR, nothing like that, but it's still above average in terms of the overall vibrancy. I know, I laugh when I say that, because at the average HDR performer, I mean, when it comes to monitors, that's really not very impressive. It's not a very high benchmark. This is well above that, though. So you're not really going to play around on this monitor under HDR. You're not going to look at the colours and think, oh, this looks washed out. Doesn't, and I mean, it depends what you're coming from, I guess, what you're used to, but no, it doesn't really look washed out at all. So I think overall, this is a nice dynamic HDR performer. There are some good pulses of brightness. It dims very effectively. The colour gamut's decent enough to give some good vibrancy as well, and it's used appropriately under HDR. I don't have any particular issues with Samsung's implementation of the local dimming. I think they've done well to dark bias. That's a personal preference, I guess. Maybe there could have been some other settings which bias more one way or the other. It gives decent brightness for mixtures of bright and dark shade. For really bright dominant content, then yes, things could be a bit brighter. So again, coming back to that really flawed notion of the average HDR performer, this monitor is really well above that. I'm now on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. This monitor has a 165Hz refresh rate, and you can see, or hopefully see, that the game's running at 165 frames a second. That's my frame rate in the top right there, really small green number. You might not be able to see that, but it's a good solid 165, so I'm making the most out of the monitor in terms of its responsiveness at the moment. This means that it's outputting 2.75 times as much information as a 60Hz monitor, or indeed this monitor running at 60Hz or 60 frames a second. And this brings with it two main advantages. It greatly reduces the perceived blur due to eye movement. And if you're not familiar with the concept of perceived blur, there's a little bit more about that in the written review, and also an article linked to there all about monitor responsiveness. So do check that out if you need an explanation. It also greatly improves the connected feel. So the connected feel describes the precision and the fluidity when you're interacting with the game world, and that's nice and strong at 165Hz. It's also important in terms of optimal connected feel to have a nice low input lag. And in this case, I measured 3.5 milliseconds, a little bit higher with VRR enabled. So it went up to about 4.3 milliseconds. You can see the exact figures in the written review at the start of the responsiveness section. So a little bit higher with VRR active, but not significantly so. Very slight difference there. Really imperceptible for most people, but technically is still higher with VRR active. And if you have VRR control on as well, then that goes up to around 10 milliseconds, and I will cover VRR control when I get to that a little bit later on. This is a good low level of input lag anyway, without VRR control on. So with VRR active, fine. Without VRR active, even better. Low level of input lag indicates a low signal delay, which most people would be just fine with. Pixel responses are another important aspect of perceived blur. And then this model, I have to say, is very impressive actually for a VA panel, a VA model, in terms of pixel responses. It isn't perfect in this respect, and if you compare to some fast IPS models, there are some, let's call them standout weaknesses for certain shades, which are beyond what you'd see on those fast IPS models. But this is by no means a bad performer in this respect, so I really don't want to be overly critical here, because I think most people are going to be very happy with how this performs. So I'm just going to show you some Pursuit photographs on the screen. Again, if you're not familiar with the term Pursuit photography, or you don't really understand what these are showing, please do refer to the written review. There's a greater exploration of this, and they're also shown at various different refresh rates there, and I really do go through this in more detail. But you can see there are different overdrive settings or different response time settings, standard, faster and extreme. There's also VRR. The reason I've put that there is because under VRR you can't adjust the response time setting, but it performs very similarly to standard. Now you might be able to see there are also two reference screens. There is the CQ32G3SU, which I've referred to a few times in this review already. That's that AOC monitor with the modern AU Optronics VA panel. And there's also the M27Q, the Gigabyte M27Q. The reason I've included that is not because it's the fastest IPS model out there, it isn't. It's a reasonable IPS performer. It's because it's at a level which most people are very comfortable with, so I think it's a good one to include in these comparisons. If you look at the faster and extreme settings, there's quite a bit of overshoot on the Samsung, and actually for some transitions not shown here, the overshoot, even with the faster setting, is really very obvious. There's some really bright halo trailing, which is brighter than the background and stands out. There's some sort of inky looking or dirty trailing, which is darker than the background as well. So I would stick to standard, or if you're using VRR, you get a similar experience to standard anyway, and you can't adjust the response time setting. So there are some weaknesses if you look closely at the pictures, and sort of when you're gaming in general, if you're sensitive enough, you might pick these up, but they're not massive weaknesses. So if you compare to the AOC, the CQ32G3SU, that has obvious smeary trailing, particularly for the dark background there. You know, there's a big bold smear that extends far behind the UFO. For the Samsung, there is a bit of a bold initial trail, particularly for the dark background, which is the top row. But that's not as extensive, nowhere near as extensive as that smeary trailing you can see on the AOC. And I'd also add that the AOC actually isn't the worst VA performer I've used, far from it. So the Samsung really does very well for the panel type. There isn't the same kind of bold initial trail with the Gigabyte, although there's more of what I would call powdery trailing, particularly if you look behind the UFO cockpit, the yellow UFO cockpit. But anyway, yes, there's more analysis in the written review for these, and really the purpose of these video reviews is more to try and give you some specific in-game examples beyond what I cover in the written review, or beyond the pursuit photographs in the written review anyway. Overall pixel responses are very good, actually very fast for most transitions. So it's mainly lighter to medium shades shown here with a few dark shades mixed in. And it's really very uncharacteristic of a VA panel, what I'm seeing here. So there is a degree of perceived blur due to some weaknesses in pixel response times, but I would describe them at most as a heavy powdery trailing in places, just for some transitions, not really so much in this scene. Maybe a little bit for the very dark shades towards the edge there, but it doesn't smear like you typically see on a VA panel, even if I move quickly. There is also some overshoot. It's not going to come out on the video very well because it's not extreme overshoot by any means, but there is some halo trailing around the wall there. I can see a little bit of this sort of dirty trailing, I suppose you might call it, around the clouds there. So a little bit of overshoot. It's not strong, it's not in your face overshoot. Certainly not at these kind of nice high refresh rates. So it's not something that most people really going to pick up on or find bothersome. If you're particularly sensitive to overshoot, then you know you might pick up on it, and unfortunately you can't completely eliminate it because standard is the lowest response time setting, and if you're using VRR it's going to be basically using that as well, something very similar to that. So if you're super sensitive to overshoot, it's kind of something you'll just have to put up with this model, but it's not strong again, it's not extreme. I'm now on a different scene on Battlefield 5, and some of you might be gasping if you've seen my video reviews before. You'll be aware that this scene has a lot of darker shades involved, so there are transitions which VA models like this typically struggle with. And yes, it does highlight the relative weaknesses of this model as well, but again, thankfully there is not that smeary look to the trailing, black smear, whatever you want to call it. So those canoes there would often, on VA panels, even quite fast VA models, it'd usually be like this sort of smoke-like appearance around them, smeary trailing all over the place. Doesn't happen here. Again, there are some examples of what I would call maybe heavy powdery trailing, but isn't quite smeary trailing. It's not so bad. And it's not something which most people are necessarily going to pick up on. And again, lots of IPS panels will show this kind of behaviour as well. Particularly fast ones, not so much, but the likes of the M27Q have some slower transitions as well. And some transitions on this model, actually quite a few transitions on the Neo G7, are faster than the M27Q. And that's why I like to use it as a comparison there. It doesn't really matter which transitions I look at, there's nothing that really stands out like a smear or smeary trailing. So Samsung has definitely done very well indeed, or maybe panel manufacturer CSOC can get some credit as well, but really some of the higher end Odyssey models like this one, they're really very unique in the VA world in terms of their pixel response performance, because it is very good. There is some overshoot though. Not a lot, I have to say, just some traces, a little bit more obvious than in the last scene I showed you there perhaps. So there's a sort of a little bit of a blue halo trail around the tree there. Perhaps it's partly due to pixel response time weaknesses as well, slight pixel response time weaknesses, and around the flag. I'm not sure if this will come across on the video, and maybe it'll be exaggerated on the video, don't know. These aren't really very easy to show on the video. But again, there's nothing that really stands out in an obvious way. It doesn't smack you in the face or anything like that. The monitor also offers VRR support, variable refresh rate. It has HDMI 2.1 VRR. It supports NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. It supports AMD FreeSync Premium Pro. You can use all of that. I tested FreeSync and I tested NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. I tested HDMI 2.1 VRR technically because if you're using NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode via HDMI 2.1, that's actually what you're using. But whichever you're using, you have to have adaptive sync or what would be called FreeSync Premium Pro if you're using an AMD GPU or perhaps a games console as well. So that's the setting. You have to enable that even if you're trying to use HDMI 2.1 VRR because it's actually just a VRR toggle. Anyway, with this enabled, the monitor will remove tearing and stuttering from frame and refresh rate mismatches. It has a floor of operation of 48 Hz, or that's claimed, maximum 165 Hz if you have the monitor set to 165 Hz. But the floor of operation is a little bit higher than that. You can see more about that in the written review, a little bit higher. I measured, I think it was 53 with my AMD GPU, or up to 53. It kind of triggers LFC, low frame rate compensation, at a slightly different point, depending on the fluctuations going on. And with my NVIDIA GPU, it worked down to 55 Hz, and then it tended to kick this LFC, or frame to refresh multiplication. If you're not aware, by the way, LFC is where the refresh rate will stick to a multiple of the frame rate to keep tearing and stuttering at bay, and it does work very well. But when the boundary is crossed, and I have to say again, very little difference between it being 48 Hz or 53 or 55, it makes little difference in practice unless you happen to be hovering around very, very specific refresh rate range or frame rate range in your game. But there is a momentary stuttering when it kicks in, and there are also some flickering issues with this monitor. I'm just going to quickly go through them. So you will be able to see this quite readily, I'm assuming, on the video, this flickering. It's not the video going crazy, it actually is from the monitor. This is a specific VRR flickering test, so the refresh rate is going all over the place, it's fluctuating heavily, which does cause this flickering. So if I bring up information there, you can see the refresh rate there, that reflects the frame rate in a VRR environment, it's going all over the place. Usually when you're gaming, you wouldn't have these kind of fluctuations, so you wouldn't see this much flickering. It can happen from time to time. With this model, it's not too bad actually, but I don't want to get too technical. You can read more about this in the FreeSync experience section of the written review, so I don't want to get too much into the sort of causes of this here in this video. It isn't something which I found bothersome when I was in the sort of triple digits. When I was in double digit frame rates and it was fluctuating quite a lot, so let's say it dropped from 90 Hz to 50 Hz quite suddenly, that kind of thing, that would be quite noticeable flickering. There is a setting VRR control, which I'm just going to quickly mention, which will eliminate this. Samsung are very secretive about this, so I don't know exactly what it does, but what I can tell you is yes, it gets rid of the flickering, but it kind of doesn't really give a full VRR experience or proper VRR experience, because there's also noticeable stuttering, even when the frame rate is pretty stable. Now I should caveat this, it's noticeable to me, I'm sensitive to stuttering, not everyone is so sensitive to stuttering, and it isn't as extreme as the stuttering that you'd get with frame and refresh rate mismatches if you had VRR disabled but you were using VSync. That's more extreme stuttering, and you don't get any tearing either way. But I don't like this setting. It does increase input lag as well, as I mentioned before. The stuttering is just a pain, and for me it's more like almost like a non-VRR or semi-VRR experience, so I really don't like that. I'm just running the Pendulum demo now, the NVIDIA Pendulum demo, G-Sync Pendulum demo. I am using an RTX 3090, by the way, in case you're wondering at the moment, but I have tested with an AMD GPU, and the flickering and all this was much the same, the VRR experience in general. You might be able to see some flickering every now and then. I don't know if it'll come across in the video, but to my eye, I can certainly notice it quite readily. Reason it's happening a lot at the moment is because I have set it so that it's crossing that LFC boundary in either direction. It's going above and below. So if you're frequently passing that LFC boundary, not only do you get this stuttering, which could be noticeable just at the boundary, but also this flickering. You can also notice it in in-game menus as well, and certain cutscenes, that kind of thing, because the refresh rate can just fluctuate in a way which causes this flickering. But yeah, when I'm sort of gaming generally, I don't have such an issue. I'm not super sensitive to this kind of thing though, but I've used VA panels where they really do my head in with this flickering, and this one isn't that bad at all. Just something that's worth mentioning if you are sensitive to flickering though. Got the game running at 100 Hz now, 100 frames a second, and I have noticed overshoot. Now this monitor, it's quite interesting. It does use a degree of variable overdrive, which means that this overshoot is not super widespread. It's actually only with these darker shades where you'll see it. They're not all darker shades actually, it's just that these particular transitions, sort of dark shades with medium dark shades or medium shades in the background, can certainly trigger this halo trailing. Hopefully we'll be able to see this in the video around the flag. But to my eye, that's pretty eye-catching. It's not extreme, but it's fairly eye-catching and certainly more noticeable than anything I saw at 165 Hz. But VRR is doing its thing. And this is linked to the refresh rate specifically, so if you are not using VRR and the game's running at 100 frames a second, it's not going to suddenly start overshooting. It's not how it works. And the connected feel isn't as good because I'm at a lower frame rate, and there's a greater amount of perceived blur as well. And yeah, there's some isolated overshoot. I'm going to call it isolated overshoot, not extreme, but just what I'm sort of talking about here. But overall, the pixel responses are tuned fairly well for 100 Hz, I'd say. So you don't get kind of an introduction of smeary trailing or any really strong weaknesses. And actually, if anything, the powdery trailing is sort of less of an issue around 100 Hz as well. The heavy powdery trailing is less noticeable because the pixel response requirements for good performance have been decreased. I'm running it at 60 Hz now, 60 frames a second in the game. That overshoot is more noticeable, pretty eye-catching now actually. But I would like to point out again that these are isolated transitions which are showing this. It's not like you're going to play a game and this is going to be all over the place. It's just some scenes will show it, some particular elements of scenes can show it. So yes, it does have some degree of variable overdrive because this overshoot isn't all over the place. It's not extreme like you can get with some adaptive sync models, but it isn't as well tuned as, for example, NVIDIA G-Sync module monitors, actual full-fat G-Sync monitors. And again, yes, decrease in connected feel, big increase in perceived blur. Aside from this overshoot, the pixel responses are fairly well tuned as well. I mean, there's a little bit of powdery trailing, slight weaknesses in places. I wouldn't say this is a perfect 60 Hz performance, but it's not bad at all. And actually, compared to most VA models at 60 Hz, it's a lot better. So that's really the sort of takeaway from all of this, is the monitor supports VRR, works pretty well, some flickering to be aware of if you're sensitive to that kind of thing. Sort of semi-variable overdrive or partial variable overdrive experience. And in terms of the pixel response weaknesses, not bad at all for the panel type. Some weaknesses to be aware of if you're particularly sensitive to those kind of things. But I think for most people, they're going to find the overall responsiveness, the gaming experience, and the VRR experience just fine on this model. There is a strobe backlight setting. I'm just going to briefly mention that. It's called Extreme MBR. You can only use it if you've got VRR deactivated. But it is a really horrible setting. It's very badly tuned. It is explored actually more briefly than I'd usually explore them because it's such a bad setting in this case in the Vision review. And it's just got loads of strobe crosstalk. It doesn't really achieve its main aim. If you've got the monitor set to 120 Hz, then there's this weird shifting that you can notice with the strobe crosstalk in front and behind the object. It's just a real mess, so I wouldn't recommend using it. To wrap up then, I didn't find that the monitor's build quality was really up there with the premium price tag, to be honest. That would be sort of my main initial gripe when I was using the monitor, and that's because it had a lot of wobble to it. I prefer my monitors to be firmer than that. Also thought that the stand design was not the best in terms of the depth. It did take up quite a lot of depth on the desk, more than it had to. I also prefer my stand bases to be brushed metal or coated metal, just gives it a nicer feel. So I didn't feel the construction really matched the sort of premium price tag in this case. Good ergonomic flexibility though. The curve, well, you know, it's going to be very subjective. I'm not a huge fan of curves that are this steep or just in general actually, on 16:9 monitors. I mean, I don't really mind them on 32-inch models like this generally if they're not so steep, but in this case it was something which I didn't fully adapt to even after using the monitor for a few weeks, and it certainly isn't the first curved monitor I've used, so I know how it goes. I kind of liked it for casual gaming, or I didn't mind it I should say, and for movies as well. Just drew you in a little bit, added an extra sense of depth. On the desktop I don't really see any benefits to it, it just can be a little bit annoying at times. So again, it's one of those things that's very subjective. Some people will like it, some will warm to it, other people won't like it. The resolution and the screen size, nice combination. I've used quite a few monitors which are around 32 inches, 4K UHD now. It's good. Weren't any particular issues with sort of text rendering or anything like that on this one either. In terms of the contrast performance, nice and strong, definite strength of this model, around 3500 to 1 static contrast under my test settings. Bit of VA glow, some black crush as well, not extreme amounts of either really. The screen surface, a touch grainy than I'd like, but still light to very light matte in terms of its layering, quite good. In terms of its glare handling, decent, and doesn't flood the image too much with lots of hazy glare. Depends on your lighting conditions though. The local dimming solution was really good as well. You can use that under SDR, and it gave probably one of the most dynamic SDR experiences I've had on a monitor actually, particularly if you turn the brightness up. Personal preferences come into play in terms of the brightness levels, but it does let you adjust that with the local dimming. You can make it very dynamic, a bit less dynamic, kind of dynamic, whatever you want to go for. It did tend to dark bias a lot, which is good in terms of reducing haloing, but also can drag down some brighter shades and even some medium shades that are a bit dimmer than they would ideally be. Still something which I did like to use when I was gaming, except competitively, and also when I was just watching video content, that kind of thing. Not so hot on it on the desktop. In terms of the colour reproduction, decent colour gamut, really not as wide as some quantum dot solutions provide. 91% DCI-P3, lots of extension beyond sRGB, good dose of extra vibrancy. There were some colour consistency issues, so yes, the saturation was lost a bit towards the bottom of the screen and the edges. This wasn't as strong as some of the newer AU Optronics VA panels, and I don't mean newer than this panel, I just mean some of AU Optronics' newer VA panels. But these shifts were not extreme anyway. I've certainly seen worse from VA models than I saw here. sRGB emulation as well. You can adjust the brightness, which is good, but it does lock the colour channels, and my unit was a bit on the cool side. I explore this more in the written review than the video review, to be honest, so I would certainly recommend, again, checking out the written review if you haven't already. But it does its thing to give a more muted and, I suppose, more as the developers intend look, really. The HDR performance of the monitor, I actually quite liked it. I've used a lot of monitors under HDR, and this was definitely one of the better performers I've come across. I'm not saying it's the best, and it doesn't excel in all areas, but I did find it was quite a well-balanced experience. The local dimming solution was good for giving a dark biased experience, so it did promote a nice atmospheric look to darker shades, give really nice depth there, actually nice depth to medium shades as well, adding a bit of solidity there. Some good bright pops as well, good bright highlights. It didn't cope as well with bright dominant scenes as some I've seen. The Asus PG32UQX, a great classic example I like to give there. I know that's a lot more expensive than this model. It's really a bit of an apples to oranges comparison, different panel type. I know so far in the review I haven't really criticised Samsung too much for their HDR 2000 marketing. I didn't even mention that really, but it's just that it's something which I think would be better forgotten because it does not reach 2000 nits in any of my testing. I tested with very specific test patches. I also tested in-game with various different scenarios, and I got a bit above 1000 nits, but nowhere near 2000. And again, with these bright dominant scenes, there is some dimming, and then with very small bright areas, there can be some dimming because of the dark biasing of the local dimming solution. And with 1196 dimming zones, it doesn't give you OLED level precision, but as far as LCDs go, I still think it was a very nice experience really, with more of a nod towards the contrast side of things. HDR colour reproduction, well, the gamut's not really wide enough to fully excel in that area, but it's enough to give a vibrant look overall rather than looking washed out. Responsiveness was good overall, actually. Good pixel responses for the panel type. Not perfect, some weaknesses, but unfortunately those weaknesses didn't extend as far as, and pun intended here, smeary trailing, which really extends very far out from the objects. The greatest weakness, I guess I'd call it, heavy powdery trailing. So, I mean, it's not as strong as some of the stronger IPS performers, but some IPS models have weaknesses of this kind of nature. There was some overshoot as well. 165 Hz, this wasn't bad. VRR did work to get rid of tearing and stuttering from frame and refresh rate mismatches, worked on the AMD and Nvidia side. HDMI 2.1 VRR, and the fact that it does have HDMI 2.1 will be very appealing to some users as well, particularly console users. There were some issues with VRR flickering, not extreme. I've certainly seen more extreme issues on VA models before, but there are some issues to be aware of there. So overall, you know, it is a premium priced monitor, and in some respects it does give quite a premium experience, I'd say. If you're after a nice HDR contrast experience and you're after some decent bursts of brightness with your HDR as well, and just in general you're after sort of a contrast first experience, you still want decent responsiveness, you don't want to suffer from the usual VA issues in that respect, then I think this can be a nice option. I would say, you know, it does have its quirks, and because of that I don't want to sort of outright recommend it, and particularly when I bear in mind its price, which is above $1,000 US. It does fluctuate between around 1,300 and as low as 1,100 depending on when you're looking, and sale pricing and that kind of thing. But either way, it's not a cheap monitor, it's a premium monitor, and it does have some issues. So you kind of have to weigh that up for yourself, whether the issues will be bothersome to you and what you really want from the experience. And I think that this can provide an enjoyable experience. In terms of comparisons, pretty much everything would be kind of apples to oranges in my opinion. This is quite a unique product. The closest competitor would actually be the Samsung Odyssey Neo G8, 240Hz version of this. And with that, you do have to be aware of those static interlace pattern artifacts, as I call them. They are a lot more noticeable at 240Hz. So I'd say that actually that can be a bit of a pain if you are sensitive to them. I'm quite sensitive to them. It's also more expensive than this monitor, so you pay a premium. Aside from the refresh rate and a bit to do with the pixel response tuning, sort of around that, it really does offer a similar experience, and there are some aesthetic differences as well. It does look a bit different. It's got more white than black, and the cheek light's a little bit different, that kind of thing. So that's really all there is to the Samsung Odyssey Neo G7. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. You can also join the channel, get exclusive benefits such as early access to our video reviews and other videos, but even just liking this video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, nice way of showing your support as well.